All right. Yeah, so this is a little different than what we've been doing in the past. Um, we're veering a little off track, and we are talking about some history based, of course, for sure, but history in how it relates to today and things that are happening today and things that we've kind of wound up with and sort of questioning that. So today we're talking about the title is Why 435, as you can see on the slide, a discussion of the history of the number of the House of Representatives. And there's a lot of talk. A lot of people don't know much about this and how we got here. So Chuck's going to talk about the history, how we got here, and some of his own recommendations and thoughts. And you have a chance to chime in. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And you can also jot them down, remember them, and at the end we can have a nice, robust discussion. And then the next talk in November, I don't have the date right here in front of me. While I stall, I will look it up. But it's usually the last. I usually like to do this on the second to last Monday. Like for some reason we like Mondays, but it's Monday the 20th. So that's the Monday before Thanksgiving. Monday, November 20th. We'll be talking about gerrymandering, or as Trish likes to say, gerry-meandering. But we will talk about gerrymandering. We will meander through the gerrymandering on the 20th of November. We'll talk about the history of that, how that all started, and where we are at today. But it's kind of a compendium to this talk. And I'm not sure, I don't think we have anything lined up for December, if we're even doing something in December, but I'm sure we'll come up with something. We will get back to the president at some point. We'll pick it up, maybe skipping over FDR as discussed and coming back to a more extensive FDR at some point. But there's just too much to talk about with FDR in one talk. So we may have to do a series talk on that. But anyway, without further ado, this is my brother, full disclosure, Chuck DeWitt Jr., son of Chuck DeWitt Sr., and my brother. And he lives in Oregon, and he's doing all of us a great service by doing this wonderful research. And thanks for coming, Chuck.
Thanks, Michelle, as always. And it's a whole lot of fun to be here today for this presentation. This particular presentation is, as Michelle has explained, a little bit off topic for me, and thus it did present a bit of a challenge. It wasn't simply a biographical sketch. It was kind of a concept and a rule change, and kind of how it got lost in the cracks of history. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is to explain how we got to that number 435 and why it's become somewhat of an untouchable number to many. Most people haven't even questioned the reason why it's the number that it is. So it occurred to me several years ago that this is a number that should be a bit higher, and my research has proven that this discussion goes back to the very, very foundations of our country. This was a major discussion amongst our founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So we'll go from there on to the 1920s, when you saw congressional gridlock kind of stall the apportionment proceedings that had been going on unchecked for the prior 150 years. And we'll talk about the 1920s up until today and where we stand. So we begin at the origin, the Constitution's apportionment clause, which is Article 1, Section 2, we're going to be particularly looking at today. And you see it on your screen there. And the most important point that we're going to discuss here is the ratio of representatives that was proposed by the founding fathers at this time. And the number of representatives, as you can see here, was stated to be no less than 30,000 per representative. So that's 30,000 citizens represented by one individual, and no less than that number. And also the provision here does account for who amongst our citizens will be counted. And you see here also we have the origin of the 3/5 clause, which counted slaves as 60% of a person, which created an immediate backlash amongst many participants here at the Constitutional Convention. So the apportionment clause was encoded here in the Constitution as ratified. However, it did not get here without controversy and debate. None other than the father of the Constitution, and we'll see him in our next slide, James Madison, quickly realized his mistake, as he is considered to be the author of most parts of the Constitution, including this section. And as we move on to Mr. Madison's slide, we recognize that it was James Madison from the beginning who saw this part as the biggest defect in his Constitution. As he saw it, the 30,000 section, the 1 to 30,000 section, was missing a coordinating maximum size. And what his attempt to do after recognizing this mistake was to correct it by what we now know as the Bill of Rights. At the time, the Bill of Rights was known as the 12 Articles. In fact, there were originally 12, not 10, amendments to the original Constitution. And once the Constitution was passed with this defect, it became very, very important to Mr. Madison to put a correction on it. So the Constitution was passed as is, and Madison's first role was to author a correction. In this, he decided that the 30,000 minimum number needed a 50,000 on the maximum side, and he inserted this new provision into his 12 articles. Like I said, we now know them as the Bill of Rights, 1 through 10. The original 12 were referred to as articles, as I said, and the first of the articles by Madison was indeed this revision of the constitutional apportionment section. The second article became 200 years later known as the 27th Amendment, which is the provision that does not allow Congress to vote on its own salary. It does not allow a sitting Congress to vote themselves a raise, basically. So interestingly, these first two articles were dropped by the states when they were doing their ratifying of the Bill of Rights. And what became known as the Bill of Rights were actually Articles 3 through 12. So they shifted those articles back to the 1 through 10 slot and simply dropped number 1 and number 2, much to Madison's chagrin. And he also was a sitting congressman at the time. He had defeated James Monroe in a race for one of the first seats in Virginia. So when he went to Congress as a member, he brought his corrections with him, and only 10 of the 12 were approved, now known as our Bill of Rights. Interestingly, the 2 that were dropped by the House had to do specifically with restrictions on the House. The other 10 had nothing to do with restrictions. They were basically, as we now know, guarantees to the citizens of the country, as opposed to restrictions on the legislators of the country. So we see a chagrined Madison fail in his effort to correct this flaw. And we also have to mention Mr.
Want me to move to the next slide, Chuck? Or am I going to the next slide?
Next slide is George, yes.
Can you just tell me every time you want me to change, and I'll change? Just say next slide, okay?
Okay. And we meet George here. The reason I included George in this discussion is that during the debates on the Constitution, this is before it was ratified, George Washington was a silent observer of the proceedings. He sat there solemn, kind of in the background, did not feel moved to participate, did not feel moved to throw his 2 cents in, until the 1 to, at the time, 40,000 ratio was proposed during this apportionment part of the discussion. This is the only time George stood up, and he was, again, very tall, so he stood up in his towering fashion, and he adamantly pushed for the 30,000 number. So none other than the father of the country was in agreement with James Madison that we need to not only lock in the 1 to 30,000 as a minimum representation, we also need to cap the number somewhere, so the likely ratio would fall between the minimum and maximum, given the mathematics put towards the apportionment prior or following each census. So we meet yet another founding father on the next slide. This is Mr. James Wilson from Massachusetts. His contribution in this debate was very simple. He envisioned, along with population growth, he envisioned within 100 years of the Constitutional Convention, so he was talking by the late 1880s, James Wilson saw a Congress or a House holding 600 plus members. He was simply doing the math of a increasing population, and he saw the numbers growing in the House to 600 plus by, say, the turn of the 20th century. So this is a very practical visionary. We don't really see many of his quotes in our founding fathers' collections, but he was just watching a country grow, and he thought it was natural that the House should grow with it. Remember, at the time of this debate, the House of Commons, the English legislative body that we were breaking away from, had a membership of well over 500, close to 600 members, with a population of around between 8 and 10 million, depending if you count Scotland or not at the time. So these people who were formulating our government were well aware of representational government and how the ratio would work best in a populace that wanted to hold the reins of the government and not turn into a monarchy or an oligarchy. Wilson was very aware of this and was a proponent of a gradually growing House number. And our last and final founding father, who we'll meet on this early part of the discussion, the next slide, is the little known, and it's somewhat misspelled there. We see it should be Melancton without the I at the end. Melancton Smith, New York patriot, judge. He was a sheriff. He was a constitutional representative at the convention in 1787, and was a very, very ardent anti-federalist, which means that he was an opponent of Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and even George Washington, in a sense, in his belief that the states were handing too much power over to a federal system. And in particular, he pointed to this apportionment argument very, very specifically. And his argument comes through in this statement right here, quote, "It is a power inconsistent with every principle of a free government to leave it to the rulers to determine the number of representatives of the people. There was no kind of security except in the integrity of the men who were entrusted. And if you have no other security, it is idle to contend about constitutions," end quote. And that's from 1787. In other words, if you don't let the people's house get figured out by the people, we really don't have anything to talk about regarding a federal constitution. So he was an adamant backer of representational government, and threatened to block the constitutional passage in New York. Was eventually convinced to sign on to the Constitution, but again, he had many reservations, and this was one of them. And I also believe he was not directly involved in the argument about the capping of the number. In other words, he just saw a danger in the way that the dictating of the House seating arrangements were going to be. He wanted it to remain fully in the hands of the people. So we have the founding fathers and their discussion, and we move along to the next slide, which is going to be an indication of the House of Representatives seal, and we also see a flag with this seal often. And this is just to let you know that the period following the constitutional debates kind of sailed along quietly. So when the article of the first, meaning the correction by Madison, was defeated, basically the number got locked in at no less than 30,000 per representative seat. By not fixing a upper end on that seat, what we've seen since this time is a continual growth in the number of people represented by a single House member. Early on, and we'll see charts later to show this more clearly. Early on, we had a representation of about 1 to 34,000. It was a little more than 30,000. Today, our representation is approximately 1 to 760,000 citizens. It is one of the worst representative ratios in the world for democratically run countries. And it is one that is actually fixable. This procedure that was determined by the House in the 1790s, every 10 years was repeated. In other words, after the census years of 1790, 1800, 1810, et cetera, the House would formulate and pass a bill that would allocate the number of seats to be divvied up amongst the states according to population shifts. But there were always, in those first 12 or 13 censuses, there were always additional seats added on to the existing seats. So the rule was, for all those years, no one loses a seat. All states will either hold the same or gain seats during this process. And the process went along fairly smoothly until the 1840s. There was a glitch in the 1840s where they had some problem in this formation of the bill. The seats did not grow during this time for that census. And then again during the Civil War, we see another stretch where seats did not grow. Of course, many seats were taken out by the Confederate movement. So we saw a static number, even a loss of seats for that 1860s period. And then again, the numbers start to grow through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Of course, we have increasing immigration during these times. And we also have a very odd moment in the Census Bureau in 1880. And this is important for the discussion as we come across it a little bit later. In 1880, the Census Bureau decided that there were going to be new definitions of what constituted an urban environment. Prior to 1880 census, an urban population was considered to be 8,000 or more. So any city at the number of 8,000 or higher was considered an urban population. For some reason, in 1880, they lowered that number from 8,000 to 2,500. So now officially, according to the government, an urban area is now a lower number at 2,500 citizens. And the reason for this shift is unknown. There is no smoking gun on this one. But what it did, it changed the concept of America. It was the beginning of the change of the concept from America being a rural, agricultural-based society, and this is the shift to the urban industrialization of America. It's not a shift in reality. It's really more of a shift in numbers. It's almost like a shift, for example, I was trying to use this example the other day. It's like when the American Medical Association decided a few years ago to change the threshold for what constitutes high blood pressure. They actually did this. So they lowered the threshold by 15% or something like that, which included a whole bunch more people into the category of high blood pressure who the day before that ruling were considered not high blood pressure. They were considered, on the border or just, elevated. Now they're officially into a high category. And that's what happened in the census situation. So it changes the perception more than the reality. And so now government officials, city officials, newspaper editors are starting to pick up on this urbanization story, and this does directly lead us to the problems that we will come across in the 1920s. But again, just to finish this period here in between the major events, right around the year 1900, we also see a change in the Census Bureau, and this is important as well. The Census Bureau decides to follow the wave of the technocrat. They decide to put a lot more stock in statistical analysis and algorithmic equations and these sort of things that are supposedly attractive because they do not involve politics. And I'm putting that in quotes. According to the advocates, this is a political free. One of the quotes was, "It's a view from nowhere," meaning that this is the most unbiased way to approach problems of modern society. We put our numbers into the machine and we let them crunch, and whatever comes out we go with, and it's not a bias towards one side or the other. And next we will meet the people who were the first faces of these technocrats in the Census Bureau. The first gentleman we will meet is Mr. Walter Wilcox. Next slide, please. And Mr. Wilcox, here he is. This is one of our early statisticians in this country, Amherst trained, and very much an advocate of algorithmic formulas. He was a believer in the view from nowhere, the belief that numbers and statistics will provide answers where humans will fail. One of the things Mr. Wilcox did not factor in to his statistical analysis beliefs was the fact that racism and xenophobia also play a role in these statistical gathering efforts, and we certainly see this with Mr. Wilcox. He was very well known amongst the defenders of white supremacy because of his papers based on statistics that he released during the period of, say, about 1890 to 1910. These were quasi-academic. They were often published privately. They were not official government documents, but again, starting around 1899, he starts working for the Census Bureau. And around that same time, a paper of his comes out called Negro Criminality, which is often cited by extreme racists of the time to justify their very anti-Black actions and behaviors. So again, while Wilcox never acknowledged this as being a factor in his statistical gathering, there's no doubt that it played a factor. One example would be during that period in the 1890s when he ends up at the Census Bureau, he's asked to gather statistics on lynching. He is an advocate of increasing Census Bureau questions to get more information on the populace, but he refuses to gather information on lynching. And it's supposed it's simply because it's just shedding a bad light on people he didn't want to shed a bad light on. So by suppressing the information, it becomes a topic that is under the radar, literally. There are people who are even mildly concerned who are saying, well, where's the evidence? Where's the proof? Well, if there's no proof if you choose not to gather the evidence. So again, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy motif with Mr. Wilcox, and we'll meet his protege on the next slide. This is Mr. Joseph A. Hill, statistician as well. His career goes on a little bit further than Mr. Wilcox in the government. Joseph ends up being I believe a 3 or 4 decade Census Bureau director and administrator. And his beliefs are not that different than Walter Wilcox. There's less of the overt racism in Hill's work, but there's certainly one overriding theme that we see with Mr. Hill. And again, he's responsible for the census material and collating it and getting it to Congress so they can do their apportionment properly with the right information. And what Hill and Wilcox both saw after the 1900 census. They went to the congressional hearings to kind of see how the sausage was made, so to speak, and they were appalled by the log rolling and the deal making and the kind of the back and forth of the political aspect of the census and its ramifications towards the apportionment. And they wanted a different system. They wanted an automated algorithmic system for apportionment that would end the debating, it would end the log rolling, it would end the deal making, and it would just be a simple process. You plug in the numbers, Congress gets the results and simply has to, seat those new members. Basically, Hill at first, one of his jobs was to provide Congress with different models of different mathematical formulas they could use. And again, like we've seen all through from 1790 to the 1910 census, every single time, except for the 1840 and for the Civil War, every single time Congress would get the census information, crunch the numbers, have their debates, and then figure it out. And they'd always add a small number of seats, usually 20, 30, maybe 40 seats. And so the population would grow with the seats somewhat proportionately. It wasn't at all 1 to 30,000. That number was slipping away slowly. By the time we hit the Civil War, it's somewhere around 1 to 100,000, which we'll see in a later graph. But again, Hill's goal, along with Wilcox's, is very simple. They don't want it to be so variable. They don't want to have these congressional stallings and stalemates that cripple government, that end up being more infighting than solution-based. So he was really a technocrat of an early order who thought that the cleanness of the numbers would make everything easy. But one thing that became increasingly true with Hill is that early on, his modeling included increases for the House. Not long after that, by the 1920s debate, he became a really strong advocate for the capping of the House. And we'll learn more about that as we go. But it's really an interesting kind of storyline to say that this man right here, Joseph Hill, and his predecessor, Walter Wilcox, are probably the two men most responsible for us having lost so much representation since the 1910 census, because these were the two that had the vision of the cap. They didn't care about representational government. They cared about efficiency. They cared about clean, number-based technological advances in how governing worked. So it's odd to think that these two obscure men, who most people have no idea I certainly had no idea who they were before this report. It's weird how they end up having so much influence, because what they did is they set in place. They didn't lock it in place. They just set in place a very difficult system to get out of. And we'll learn more about that as we go. Next slide, please. We're going to meet a very, very interesting man here, James Weldon Johnson. We should all know more about this guy. He was a Renaissance man of the first order, poet, musician, entertainer, activist. And in 1920, he was the field executive for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, still with us today. And Mr. Johnson, in December of 1920, went to a Congress hearing being held by the Census Department. And he went there to present his own story about why the census is problematic and why apportionment is wrong and should be fixed. And he really brought a compelling case with him to Congress. But remember, just going back on the story a little bit, this is 1920. So we go back to the 1910 census, which was completed, and the numbers were crunched appropriately. And William Taft signed the bill into law in 1911, which increased the House to its current number at 435. So this is the last increase in the House in 1910, when our population was somewhere around 105 million, 110 million, or something like that. So it gets locked in 1910. And then the 1920 census rolls along. and nothing happens. It gets completed, but with lots of controversy. There's debates about the effectiveness of the census. Is it legitimate? I'll go into some of those stories here. One of the basic problems, some people said, was they were using unreliable census data because of the post-World War I transitions that were happening. You had soldiers coming back, you had workers leaving cities, going back to farms. There was a lot of transients. This is true in the 1919, 1920, 21 period. So the argument by certain politicians was that the census favored urban districts because the people hadn't come back to the farms yet post World War I. And also part of this argument was that too many non-citizens were included in this population count. Mostly this was brought up in rural Republican districts. But again, non-citizens were allowed to be counted just like they always have been in the Constitution. It's not the voting citizens that are counted for enumeration. It's all citizens. So we have another reason where Johnson comes in. This is a whole other argument about the 1920 census, and Johnson his argument was that the suppression of Black vote in the South ought to result in lower numbers of Southern representation in the South, and he was basing his thoughts squarely on the 14th Amendment, on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which said, in my own interpretation, not to quote it, but it said basically if there's voter suppression going on, then representation must be lower to reflect the voter suppression. Johnson shows up in Congress in December of 1920 with a lot of information. He has charts, he has numbers. The NAACP had been really focused on voter suppression in the South for the year or two prior to this visit. And it's a bit of an eye-opener for some. It's not surprising to others. Some Southern leadership in Congress is trying to squash this man's right to speak. They removed photographers from the photography well that day because they basically didn't want this man getting any coverage. But what happened as a result of Johnson's visit to Congress, undoubtedly, is it shed more light on the situation. I will read a quote from Johnson during that event. Quote, "We are standing on the crater of a volcano. How long can that situation go on? It is a fact, and the white light of truth beating on it is bound to reveal it. You have got to meet it with wisdom," end quote. And it was met with a lot of silence. It was met with obfuscation and distraction. But some representatives were paying attention. We have two examples of representatives who were there, ready to step up to the plate following Johnson's lead. One is a gentleman named George Tinkham from Massachusetts, a Republican, who proposes an amendment to strip Southern states of membership where voter suppression could be proven. Problem here is it couldn't be proven by people who didn't want to prove it. When Walter Wilcox chose not to gather lynching information, that was the proof that Tinkham was asked to supply and could not. So again, there's efforts here. But what they basically say to Tinkham is, well, we don't have any hard evidence to go on. So when you get back to us with hard evidence, we might think about it, which was never going to happen. And there's another Congressman, Leonidas Dyer from Missouri, who proposes an anti-lynching bill in 1921. These are directly related to Johnson's speech to the Census Bureau administrators in December of 1920. Nothing becomes of either of those. But again, it's the first time it gets into the national spotlight that lynching is a problem. And it's a problem, obviously, for life and death, but it's a problem down to the level of voting. You know, voter suppression has now become a spotlight issue, despite the attempts to cover that up. So as the debate protests go on, and there's plenty of debates at this time in the 1920s, that debate fades as time goes on. But here's part of the debate. We'll hear from Representative Ralph Lozier another Democrat from Missouri, quote, "There is absolutely no reason, philosophy, or common sense in arbitrarily fixing the membership of the House at 435 or at any other number," end quote. And here's one that you don't really hear much anymore. Like, for some reason, at this time it was known that this was an arbitrarily fixed number. We don't really know that anymore. We don't know what Ralph Lozier was saying then, that this is a fixed number. It's not a fixed number today. It just seems to be because it's been there for so long. So we go ahead and we see our next slide will show the Secretary of Commerce during the 1920s, a technocrat of the highest order, Mr. Herbert Hoover, who we met last time during his presidency. During this period, as Secretary of Commerce, he's in charge of the census. So he is in full lockstep with the Wilcoxes and the Joseph Hills of the world. He believes that we need some sort of permanent fix to this arbitrary and debatable thing that comes up every 10 years. So Hoover was certainly helping facilitate the automation and the automated algorithm methods in the Commerce Department. And sure enough, when he becomes president, we see the passage of, really soon after his inauguration, probably 3 months into it, he signs the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. And this legislation forces the House to relinquish their role in apportionment, including reviewing of censuses, and eliminates also the compact, contiguous, and equal proportion rule of the districts themselves, which certainly will be a part of our story next time with regards to gerrymandering. So you have a technocrat as Secretary of Commerce becoming president, easily signs this bill, which basically changes 170 years of how the House had operated. As one historian has described the result of this action, it's been an extraordinary extended limitation on our democratic system. Indeed it has been. So we go to the next slide and we meet some of the people. We meet a word first that they used a lot during this time. And the word is unwieldy. This word comes up so many times in the research for this topic that I had to include it. And this ends up being kind of the official reason for the capping of the House at 435. It's, as you can see here, it's a system too large or badly organized to function. And some would say that we have that currently in the House, but at the time when they were talking about adding seats, they were literally concerned about not just cost, they were concerned about having to buy more seats, literally. We have to buy more chairs now, one of the members said. We have to get a new office. We have to expand. This is just impractical. It's going to cost millions. So the arguments that they kept coming back to were efficiency and unwieldiness. We can't have unwieldiness in our governing body. We must have something wieldable, something manageable. So they kept using the argument that larger would make it unmanageable. And there's an obvious argument where you can agree to that, but by not looking at any other options, they pretty much got us stuck in this frame of mind. And it also has been described, it's a politics of distrust in politics, by saying that the House is not going to be allowed to do its function, and we just have to keep it at a manageable number. And while doing so, your representation gets eroded with each census. Everyone's representation fades as each population count grows. So we go to the next slide and we'll meet a few of the players behind this apportionment law of 1929. Here's the majority whip in the House, John Quillen Tilson from Connecticut, a strong advocate of this automated algorithm. He was involved in a lot of the discussions and a lot of the back and forth leading up to it. And I think in his mind, let's just get it over with and call it good. I don't believe Mr. Tilson saw it becoming a permanent number. And I believe we can say the same for the next person. Next slide will be of another representative, this man, William Bankhead, from the state of Alabama, a relatively liberal Alabaman, whose quote I will read now, quote, "The abdication and surrender of the vital fundamental powers vested in the Congress of the U.S. by the Constitution itself has been violated." So in other words, he's calling it the abdication. He's calling it the giveaway of our congressional power to a automated system, extremely vehemently against the capping at 435. And again, he wasn't alone. This was a vigorous debate both before and after it passed. The debate did not go away given its passing in 1929. So we go on and we meet another player. This would be the senator from Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg. Some may know his son, who was also a senator. This person goes back a little further, and he was the Senate voice. He was not a House member. He was in the Senate, but he was the Senate voice in favor of the automated system. Some of his quotes on this, he called this automated system a life insurance for the country. That's what he referred to it as, a life insurance. And he also, there's another quote by Vandenberg too. He saw any debate as disruptive and again, contrary to the functions of a smooth running government. So I think part of his goal was to promote this automated system, but part of it was driven by the fact that in one of the alternatives, there were actually two alternatives that they would choose starting at 1930. So following the Apportionment Act in 29, the House still had two options, and they were marginally different options. It wouldn't have increased the House very much. It was a seat or two here or there. But the 1930 census would have taken away a seat from Michigan and given it to Arkansas. So as soon as that happened, or was proposed to happen, Vandenberg steps in as being an absolute opponent of the one version and a proponent of the other version because it would save the seat for Michigan. So he was basically speaking for his home state when he becomes an advocate of the system we now have in place. So it went from about 40 potential options to two options for the decade of the 1930s. And in 1941, a vote came down which limited it to one option. And it's basically the same one we have today. It's the automated system that locks in a formula that simply shifts seats around. And we see our first graph here. It'll show the total number of representatives and population from the beginning of our country to about 1910. So what you see is a slow and gradual growth up through the 1800, and then you see it getting over 100,000 as we get to the Civil War in the 1860s. That red line is just slowly gathering, and then we see it peaking right there. We see it peaking into the 19 teens, and then we're going to see it pretty much flatline from there on. So again, I'll repeat, our ancestors, those of us who have relatives who were voting during the 19 teens and the 1920s, had a much higher ratio of representation. It doesn't matter what state they were in. It does vary from state to state, but they had a much greater degree of representation than they do today. Again, we're going from a 1 to 200,000 or so at that period to today a 1 in 760 or so thousand. So we go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about some of this interim period between the 1940s and today. Most significantly was a Supreme Court decision in 1964. It's known as Westbury versus Sanders. Not a very familiar court case to me, at least, but it's known by another name. It's known as the one person, one vote rule. And this was a case that came down in Georgia where a man sued the state of Georgia for allowing disproportionate differences between districts. I believe he was in a very overrepresented district, and he was pointing to two adjacent districts that had much lower numbers. So he felt that like his vote was washed out, so to speak, and he blamed the Georgia legislature for not rewriting their lines going back 3 or 4 decades. And the state Supreme Court in Georgia said they had no jurisdiction in this area. This was not a adjudicable case. This was a political case, and it's between the parties to decide such things. And the Supreme Court disagreed. The Supreme Court, 6-3, decided that this man had a right to sue the state due to unfair representation, and it was basically under that 14th Amendment, the Equal Representation Clause, which comes back to that one person, one vote, meaning that states should do their due diligence and do their very best to get as close to one person, one vote as possible. Meaning, Georgia should have drawn up new districts equaling out the population more fairly. And so that does have a role in this story, and it also has a role in the gerrymandering story, which we'll see next time. Leading up also to our current day, again, what happened through the period of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s is this 435 kind of gets locked in. You even have two new states added in the late 50s, Alaska and Hawaii, and it doesn't change anything. I believe they got one extra seat briefly. I think the number bumped up to 437, and then they quickly reformulated, took a couple of seats from other states, and redrew it back down to 435. So it's remarkable how we've gone from a close to a people's house at the beginning to basically a largely underrepresented house of today. And again, this is kind of the why on how we got there. There's no conspiracy, there's no directive, there's no group of people getting together deciding this. It's this kind of a natural evolution of leadership trying to eliminate voices and others and dissenters and come up with a more homogeneous kind of procedure. And I think that this was behind the scenes what all of the people we've talked about were in favor of. Certainly the Wilcoxes and the Hills of the world, they had strong feelings about representative democracy not being that important. They trusted the elite leadership. They didn't want to entrust leadership roles to the lower end of society, as they would have described a more citizen-based House. This also lines up with the House members who want to keep control in their own states, and they want to keep control in their own hands. They don't want to diffuse control out to a larger number of people. So it's not surprising in a way how this thing got kind of rolling. What is surprising, though, is that most people don't understand this is changeable tomorrow. This is a law that is not locked in by any means. It's only kind of locked in by tradition. Just as the original 170 years of census operations was also locked in by tradition. So to kind of come across this and its origins and kind of the standing of where we are today, it all is a little bit kind of surprising in the sense of how under the radar it's gone. And it's also surprising about how locked in people really think it is. And it ends up not being the case. But to get change involves the very people whose power is threatened. Therein lies the problem. So we'll go to the next graph now, and I believe it's the uncropped graph. We showed you a cropped graph leading up to the capping of the House, and yes, this is the uncropped graph. So you see that little stepping stone, the little step, you can see it went down a little there, and then Civil War goes up, goes up, goes up, and then right at 435, it stops and flatlines. And you see our population now exceeding the graph, going up and over. This is the lineup now, which gives us the 1 to 760,000 ratio that we live with today. This is, again, when you see it like this, it's pretty stark. It really does hit you that it's been a long time that the House has been squashed and basically thwarted. And again, it leads you to think about what could have been, what might have been had George Washington been heated, or if Madison was able to get his amendment passed. What would have changed? How would we have looked different? It's really hard to say, but that's a little more speculative than what we can look at today. In that we have what we have, where do we go from here? So we'll go to the next slide, and we'll meet someone who at least was thinking about this problem. The next slide shows, I believe, a former representative from Florida. There he is, Alcee Hastings. The late Alcee Hastings passed away, I believe, last year. One of his last acts as a representative from Florida in 2021 was to look into this problem. So here you have a sitting House member with seniority. He had some clout, and he put out a proposal, and he had several subcommittee members sign on, and he was also fighting illness at this time, so I'm not sure how much effort he was able to put into it, but that pretty much just died in committee and never made it out. So this is the last effort in 2021 of any House member to even look into the situation. This was not anything binding. It wasn't legislation. It was simply time to look at it, according to Alcee, and he didn't make it, and neither did his legislation. So our next visual will be a graph showing the map of the United States, and you'll see two sets of numbers and then a third set. The two sets, the pink is the current allotment of House representatives. The green is the representatives, how they would look under something called the Wyoming Plan. Now, when you start looking this up on the alternative possibilities, the Wyoming Plan often comes up first as an alternative. And it's probably the first one online because it's the simplest in many ways, and it's also the least radical of these ideas on how we can make things look differently. The Wyoming Plan, simply described, is every congressional district will be the size of the least populated state. So you take Wyoming, which has been the least populated state since, about 1990, and that's going to be the average size of congressional districts. So that does carve up a good number of more districts and a good number of more seats in the House. I think the additional number was 136 new districts. So that would make 136 new House seats. And you can also see that in this plan, many seats don't really stand to do anything different. 10 states hold the same number. Another good chunk of states maybe gain one or two. The only states where you see a significant difference would be the large population states, like California goes from 52 to 69, for example. And you see Texas gain a bunch, Florida, New York. The typical population centers are the ones that are going to get more seats. But interestingly, this does remain pretty proportional to the current setup, meaning that under this plan, with 17 extra seats, California doesn't gain proportionally any more power than they have now. And believe it or not, if you extend out to the most radical of all of these other arrangements for our House of Representatives, this is the most radical, the one in blue. And I couldn't put all the blue numbers in there because there was just no room for some of these large numbers. But this would be the proposed House numbers if we went to that 1 to 30,000 rule. If we strictly followed that every state population divide by 30,000, they get that many folks in the House. That would put California at a whopping 1,380 members. So again, you have a huge contingency of Californian legislators in a total body of over 11,000 people. Now, talk about unwieldy. That sure sounds like it. That sounds like a number that would be hard to manage. They're doing a fairly poor job now at the 435. But interestingly, what these numbers would do, they simply would expand to a full representation, all areas of the country. It would not change California's proportional representation. That's what I kind of like about all these numbers. These numbers really don't change what we have today as far as clout or as far as weighing in. They in a legislative body sense, it would change other numbers like electoral count numbers, but it doesn't change California's influence. They're still going to have whatever the number is, 8 or 9% or something like that of the total number of legislatures, just like they do today. Same with Texas, same with Florida. So what seems like a heavily disproportionate Southern representation with these proposed numbers doesn't really change the proportion at all, because today our system of automated algorithmic apportionment is very proportional, meaning that California actually lost a seat last time in 2020, even though they gained in population. Proportionally, they didn't gain as much as others, so they had to give up a seat. And that really wouldn't look all that different with larger numbers thrown into the mix. Now, one of the best arguments I've heard for maxing out the House, meaning going to the true founding father ideal of 1 to 30,000. One of the best arguments I've heard comes from the maker of this map, my partner Deirdre, who said, if you had districts of 30,000 people, you would have such a responsive leader, such a responsive representative, because there would only be 30,000 people to legislate for. You would think that these people would have increased voices, not just in their districts, but in the national body, in the national House. You would have voting blocks of all sorts of interesting and different minority groups that would actually be able to use their coalitions as blocks, as effective tools to build movements along certain lines, as opposed to having the R&D system, which we now see is breaking down amongst itself. The idea of having smaller districts has a lot of appeal in a sense of true representation, in a sense of like it's a grassroots feel to the government. Then you would likely have far fewer career politicians. You'd have far more responsible politicians, and they'd be citizen politicians, which is how it was intended. People rotating in and then back out to their real jobs, not to their lobbyist position so they could make more money on their inside knowledge. That really wasn't the original intent. So again, to look at these different numbers, to look at how it would look, pros and cons, all very interesting. And again, the unwieldiness comes up with a legislative body of 11,000. However, with technology, this becomes more plausible. We saw this during the pandemic with a lot of state legislative bodies meeting online, Zoom chat. It didn't all go smoothly, but in many cases, it did function, and people were able to do their jobs and go to work, so to speak. So chances are you see a lot more of this with a larger legislative body. But again, the Wyoming plan adding 138 seats doesn't change much. It's the one that's most palatable, but it doesn't really change representation very much. It might lower it from 1 to 760,000, 1 to maybe down to maybe 1 to 600,000. It doesn't really change the distance between our reps and the citizens. Now we'll go to the next graph, and this is going to show again our ratio. It's that 1 to 30,000 start, and it shows you how it's changed. And you can see a real big jump right around, it's that Civil War period. It's kind of the slow growth, and then a big spurt. And that's when we get into that 1 to 100,000 zone, and we go far beyond that after the 1900s began. And we can see today how we've blown that long in the rearview mirror. We're looking at pushing 800,000. We're not that far from 1 to a million. We're actually on the road to 1 to a million within the next, say, 50 years. And that really does seem outrageous to me. No different than 1 to 780,000. Equally outrageous, because again, this was supposed to be the people's house. This was supposed to be the house, for the citizens, and the Senate was supposed to be, the chamber for the upper classes. So we are now just going to have a brief discussion about these possibilities and changes. Well, you spoiled it there, but again, we look at these models. We look at citizenry participation, and I think most people realize that we're kind of stuck at 435. The ideas for petitioning Congress. Who would you actually petition? How would a movement go about beginning to affect change in this department? One group that's out there right now called 30,000.org. I encourage you to look up their website. It's very well done. It's got a lot of the information I use today. And at the same time, despite their very good arguments, there's really no clear plan there on how to go about it. There's another site you can check out. It's 538.com, I believe. Also covers all of these topics, everything that's ever been discussed about expanding the House, but again, with no real advocacy or real plan on how to implement these ideas. I guess we can start with the basics of writing our congressman. That seems to be kind of archaic and old school, and I don't know how much of that would be effective or ever be effective. But at the same time, I know I felt kind of like cheated in a way when I did this report and got to the nitty gritty of it all. In a way, when you're taught that your house is that's your chamber, the people's chamber, and then you realize how a small number of people took that away or altered that significantly, it is kind of like you feel cheated. At the same time, I can understand the unwieldy arguments to a point, especially in the 1920s. You were facing basically the Depression right after they passed this Apportionment Act in 1929. So economy was a real concern. And, chair purchasing may have been a more real issue than it seems today. But today, I think we can look beyond the simple logistics of office space and chairs and look to really what would be a more representative population. I mean, or governing body. As far as our population goes, we have so many, not just underrepresented, we have completely non-represented citizens, including 4.3. There's 4.3 million U.S. citizens with no voting representation. And those are the ones who live in Puerto Rico, who live in District of Columbia, who live in Guam and other island holdings. They have delegates who can't vote. They can go and talk, but they have no clout. So it truly is 4.3 million U.S. citizens who are under the rules of taxation without representation. So again, it's kind of shocking and it's kind of disturbing. And at the same time, I'm certainly not an answers guy. I don't have anything other than, be aware, and it's okay to make your opinions known, to imagine a movement that would expand the House to its true, size that it was supposed to be. It's a hard thing to imagine now. And that's kind of how I think Wilcox and Hill and Herbert Hoover probably would have wanted it. I don't think they wanted at all anything close to a large body of 11,000 people, citizen legislators. I think that their opinion would have been that we can take care of those people. We know what we're doing. We can represent more people with less because we're all about efficiency. And again, it doesn't really fly. It hasn't really worked. We've just been more marginalized. And again, just the awareness of this at least starts the discussion. And And I just wanted to close on a note. We have this current event going on in the House with the stalemates and the votes and the backbiting and all of this shenanigans going on. Well, I have a proposal to end the deadlock in the House today, and this is not not illegal. What I'm proposing, it's very unlikely, but it's not illegal. But my proposal is to nominate Martha Stewart for the new Speaker of the House, and I have many reasons for this. Number one is she's very good at keeping house. I think her demeanor is perfect. It's very monotone and it's very, very cool. And I think she can also teach some useful skills like folding napkins and other things that these people may not know. And this is not illegal. What I just found out today, that anyone can be voted on for Speaker of the House. The House representatives can vote for anyone they like. They voted for Donald Trump last week. They voted for a former House member last week, so not sitting House members. But can that person actually sit as a Speaker of the House? And that's the question. Most likely, a Martha Stewart election to the Speaker of the House would be considered unconstitutional, but I'm not sure by who. Some judges might be okay with it. Some might see the actual rules and find her, as a non-legislator, she's not eligible, but it's not really written in stone. There's no set rules for this. So I think she may be the dark horse and the solution to a very vexing problem. So happy to take questions and comments at this time.
I think first we have to reduce the number of representatives. I think that it would be good if we cull the herd. I think if we just apply Rorschach tests, the old ink blot tests, we could probably eliminate about maybe 150, 200 of the people just straight out. So, a basic sanity test I think would be very good.
So we go to 1 to 2 million then representational. You're okay with that?
No, actually, we eliminate the representation down to about 200, and then we start working up from there. Such.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Okay.
So first we apply the Rorschach test to the people in the House.
Gotcha.
We should be able by that to eliminate about half of them.
I see. So a new starting point. I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, from Frank, this is just another reason why we need a constitutional convention. Unfortunately, our current political climate is not conducive to such an important endeavor. What do we do? That's from Frank.
It's not a new question, and the same. I always have the same response to this question. Who are you going to invite to that convention? I don't know. I don't know. If you gave me like a choice, if I could pick, say, 100 people from around the country, every state represented, and I'm not well versed in a lot of inside politics across the country, I can come up with about 5 or maybe 10 people who I would trust at that convention, and that's a very low number. So that's the problem is the caliber of the founding fathers we'll never see again, apparently, at least in their larger view. I mean, certainly we have intelligent people, we have people with wider backgrounds and more interesting influences, but as far as their broad view, that's what's missing. The R&D world misses a broad view all the time. The R&D world doesn't allow for people who aren't an R or a D to be participants. And this is another thing that my partner Deirdre brought up as far as the smaller districts go. You will have voting blocks of independents. You will have voting blocks of Green Party. You'll have voting blocks of all sorts of new parties will be allowed to be part of the story now, because it won't be a lockdown R&D party. You'll have much more multiple party participation. Some people cringe at that idea because to them, that's the ultimate nothing gets done scenario, where everything's fractured, everything's going off into these little subgroups, and there's no consensus on anything. Possibly, but what do we have today? We have the same without the representation, as I see it. We have the same gridlock with less representation. So I'd rather have more representation and some gridlock if that's part of it. But that's just me. And again, I have friends who are in opposition to me. One friend is absolutely opposed to the idea of expanding the numbers, as Tom just put it. For these people who we can't trust currently. Why would we want more of them? So I
Jeff wants
understand.
Oprah. Jeff is nominating Oprah for speaker.
Oh, there's another solid choice. I really do. I like the people who can rise above politics. And I know Oprah is connected to the Democrats, at least she has been. And I know Martha's connected to the Republicans, or at least she has been. But that's okay. They're more celebrity than Republican or Democrat, which is pretty much how we operate these days. So, if it takes a celebrity to get things together, well, I guess we have to be somewhat okay with that from time to time.
Jeff is saying maybe we should nominate an AI created speaker bot.
But again, who gets to create the AI speaker bot? That's the question. Is it Diebold, or is it another company that the other party tends to trust? So again, it's who controls the source. Always a part of the problem.
But as you pointed out, by increasing the number of representatives, you don't just decrease the influence of the representatives, you decrease the influence of the two-party system, because you open up the possibility. So the only way to get this done is through the current system, two-party system, and they're not going to hamstring themselves. They're not going to allow something like this to happen, because it would be fascinating, because you'll get things done, but you'll create voting blocks like you do in other countries where the blocks come together and such. But we've had the two-party system for so long, they're never going to facilitate a system which is actually going to reduce their ability to control the system itself. Even if they're fighting among themselves, they'll get together on this point.
That really is it. And that goes back to the origin story as well. The Republicans realized they were giving away power when they decided to use this permanent apportionment system. But it was worth it to them in this long view. They had the long view that in the long run, in the short run, we give up power. In the long run, we retain power. And this is exactly what you just said, Tom. This is how they've done it. I mean, just the fact that within our current system, even if you just keep everything as it is, R&D control who gets on ballots. You have to have X amount of these ballots by a certain date, which eliminates most third parties unless you're Ross Perot or millionaires of the day. So again, it's really it's hamstring is a good way to put it. It's set up to be perpetual. It's set up to have no challenges. And again, you go to the grassroots version. It's complicated, and it seems like it would be overwhelming to accomplish. Starting from the ground up. You'd be lobbying state legislators to redo districts as well. I mean, it's very, very, very unlikely to happen, and we will very much likely to never see the number change. So we're just going to lose representation. We are really going to soon be at one citizen for 1 million. It'll be one representative for 1 million citizens. We're not that far off. We're on our way. And how is that a representational body? You're speaking for 1 million people. Wow. Okay. Also, too, the smaller districts would not just eliminate party influence or reduce it, it would also reduce lobbying influence on a large scale. It would be much harder for lobbyists to operate. They would have to spread themselves much thinner, or have a lot more of them with a lot more cash. It would make it difficult. But lobbyists don't want that.
Could you just try to imagine the election system as well, from the perspective that nowadays just having a handful of elections over the course of 2 or 3 years in a given state can be traumatic to deal with. Could you imagine if you were having like 60 elections over the course of a single year in one state? It would certainly be interesting, but the word unwieldy does come in a little bit when you start thinking of it.
It does seem appropriate, yeah.
These guys, Wilcox, Hill, and Hoover, were they also, because back then there was, there always is in ebbs and flows in this country, tremendous anti-immigrant feeling. Were they using this as a means by which to try to tamp down the idea that these immigrants who are coming into the country, they will get representation, and it might be turned to the point that anyone who's able to bring them onto their party would be able to expand the coffers with these individuals? Was it kind of an anti-immigrant type of perspective on
I
it?
think it was that, but it wasn't overt. I think it was used by xenophobes, the statistics, but it wasn't. You never really saw Wilcox stepping out on a limb personally to say derogatory things. He just people used his numbers for such purposes, and in fact, a lot of his statistics were used by rural Republican legislators. There was one guy from Mississippi that kept popping up named John Rankin. And all he kept doing was trashing the 1920 census. He just undermined the 1920 census so consistently, so falsely that it becomes truth. It's the old adage, you just repeat lies, they become truths to some people. And he was very, very good at that. And he also was very good at posing the illegal voter counts in the city as inflating urban influence. Like all the time, it was the rabble of the city that gives the city politician too much power, on and on and on. And this is in the 20s as we're leading up to the Al Smith nomination of 28. So again, the urbanization versus the ruralization, and it wasn't the key factor or the main factor. It was one of many factors that played into the story. But it certainly was true, even though that population number or the urban number threshold was changed from 8,000 to 2,500. It didn't change the fact that we were urbanizing, generally speaking, as a country. More people were moving to cities for work rather than leaving cities to go to the farm outside of that post-World War I blip. So again, yeah, we were becoming more urbanized. Yes, urban politicians were gaining more control and had more seats and more clout and more districts. So that wasn't false. It just didn't often get pointed at, specifically. It was kind of lingering in the background. And one of the things I had to bring up too with Johnson's speech at Congress in 1920, they refused to print his speech on the grounds of we can't afford to. We're trying to save money, and obviously that was the efficiency excuse employed to block an embarrassing series of facts from the public. Is really what that was. But again, well, we can't afford to print his speech. You can't afford to, but it's not money. You can't afford to, morally do it because you're going to have the fingers pointed at you.
Like you said, in back rooms, they speak of one thing, but then when they go out in public, they represent something, even if it's asinine like that. It's like, oh, we're trying to save money. And you know what they're really doing.
Yes.
How can the people of the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico try to move the needle on this situation in terms of being able to get proper representation for themselves? Like you said, it's amazing to taxation without representation. What means do they have within the government now to be able to get, because it would seem like logical to try to get them some sort of representation within the government?
There have been so many attempts in Puerto Rico over the last just 50 years that I know of. They all get squashed, and I don't really know the politics or the story behind that. That's a whole other investigation, but there's got to be a compelling reason why it keeps getting blocked. And I really haven't spent enough time with it to really kind of ponder it through. But you would think, especially with the situation they just went through during the Trump presidency with the hurricane, that was an odd situation. Here was a U.S. territory not really being treated like part of the U.S. It was really treated like a backwater afterthought, and throwing paper towels out the plane or whatever he was doing. I mean, it was, again, that brought up the latest round of why isn't Puerto Rico a state? And again, I don't know the intrigue behind that. You would think it would be financially beneficial. They're already being taxed. It wouldn't affect taxes. I just don't understand what the purpose is. It might very well be the 435. Think about it. That number has become sacred. I mean, it went back because it was 437 briefly with Hawaii and Alaska. It went back to 435. Hasn't been touched since. It could simply be we can't mess with that number. It may have somehow become sacred to these people, and to move it up one or two would be, it's going to go up to 16,000 next. We can't move it. I don't know. That's the only thing I got.
Is there any way to give them representation short of statehood? I know we have it set now as statehood, but would there be any way to actually give them some sort of, am I thinking incorrectly on that? Or is there something that they could, an accommodation they can make for them all the same, short of actual statehood?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. Constitutionally, it would seem that to have an electoral vote, you have to be a state. I know that's true. They if you do the math, based on our current 435 system, I estimate at 4.3 their population is, or what was that? Oh, total. So it's about a little over 3 million. So they would end up with maybe five representatives. That's a significant number, if they were all, if they were in the House as counted members. But no, I don't know if there's a non-statehood route to representation. I don't believe there is, but it's interesting thought. And DC is even closer. They're right in the mix. They're right there in the center of action. And that's also come up multiple times for a statehood question. I think I'm assuming they're facing the same politics as Puerto Rico, as far as the people that like it the way it is are making sure it stays the way it is. I can't think of any other, because there's plenty of people who push for statehood, in both Puerto Rico and DC. There's no shortage of influential politicians who have been fully backing of statehood, and they've been blocked every time. And I don't know why.
That's unusual. Do they think in the case of DC that they just want the seat of power to be in neutral ground, something like that?
That's an original argument. That was their original argument, carving out a piece of a southern and a kind of middle Atlantic state. But I don't think that's true today. They might use that, but I don't think that's valid today.
Like you said, after what happened with the storm, I would think that there would be a strong push among the people of Puerto Rico. But I'm sure for them there's a strong push, but it's somehow on the way to Washington, it's being derailed by some crafty individuals.
Yes, and I mean, really, if you think about it, I'm almost coming up with nothing else but the 435 number. That seems to be a sticking point, because you can't have them in without adding numbers. You can't add a state without adding numbers. So it could be that we are just never going to add any more states. We just can't do it. We can't divide any states, and we can't add states, because it's going to violate the sacredness of 435. I never really thought about it that way before, but it could very well be the case. That number has become, enshrouded in permanency somehow. I don't get it. It's not. It's a law that's changeable by Congress, but the same people who benefit from it would have to change it. So, again, not likely.
But they could add the two states, and it simply would, if they kept it 435, I mean, it would cost seats from other states and such, which I assume would become annoyed at that or something. But
that was that the last time was that Hawaii Alaska thing. A couple states lost one each, and that's the last time it happened. It's the last time it happened where there was an adding and a subtracting at the same time. We've only had some shiftings, so certain states have been subtracted. Like I mentioned, California lost a seat even though they gained population, because it just lost out to a state that had more incoming people. So it's just a shift.
A certain party may want to block that too, because in the case of both DC and Puerto Rico, they would probably be overwhelmingly Democratic, right?
True. And that does go back to the origin of this rule. Remember, most of the people against it were Democrats. Most of the people for it were Republican. Most of the people for the automatic apportionment rule. It doesn't so much fall into rural urban, though. There's examples that cross over both areas, rural urban. So the party voting did not go down urban rural as much as it went down Democrat Republican. It went down. The protests all came from Democrats, and the go along with it and the this is good for the countries all came from Republicans, that I found anyway. And again, the Republicans stood to lose if you added seats, the Republicans were going to lose seats to urban Democrats. Undoubtedly, that's the trend of the time that they were trying to block. But it wasn't the primary. It was one of many smaller factors, is how I like to say. It's not the only factor.
Since you brought up the idea of the voting coming through, I noticed that the background for Michelle has changed. Has she been actually, while we were doing this program, voted in as a Speaker of the House? Look at that. She's got her gavel and everything. But
wow, I can't see that. That's cool.
It's bizarre, is you pointing out that, voting for Donald Trump for that, for instance, that you can vote for people who are not actually seated in the House. What's the purpose of that? Why would they even allow that to happen? It seems asinine.
I think it was overlooked. I think it was a rule that was overlooked because there's evidence that it was assumed, very much assumed, that it would be from the House. And there's the evidence of that shows up in many places. So the constitutional scholars that have looked at this pretty much all agree. I haven't found anyone who says, Martha could get a seat tomorrow in the House if they voted for her. They all seem to say everyone could vote for you, Tom, but you couldn't be seated unless you were a legislative member, because there's rules about resigning your other seat to take this seat. Like, for example, it's in the presidential succession law that says if you're the Speaker and you're next in line, you have to resign your oath and your seat to take the presidency, because you can't hold both. But again, it's assumed in there that you're stepping down from a oath held position in a legislative branch. The assumptions are all throughout these side stories. So that's why constitutional scholars all agree that Martha would not be seated. She would not be seatable. She would be choosable, but not seatable. And unless, the only way it would work is if she was appointed to a seat in some timely fashion to allow her to actually hold a legislative body, to be a legislative member. And that all varies from state to state, how members are appointed. Usually it's special elections for the House. They don't usually appoint House members, but some states, I believe, can temporarily till the next election. So it depends on the state.
Well, now that I'm in charge, Chuck, I propose a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, and that will solve all of our problems.
Well, it would solve some. It wouldn't solve all, but it would solve some.
But wouldn't that sort of be a way to proceed? I mean, people talk about that all the time. I mean, not that it's going to happen, but that's been
but okay. So let's just go back a little. Let's just say that, remember, the Electoral College was put in place for the same reason, although not at the same time, but for the same reason that the apportionment law of 1929 was put into place, and that's to keep democracy from being too democratic. It was a democratic check. The Electoral College was a screen. It was like a filter. So you don't have mob rule. That was the one thing that always came up in these early discussions. We can't have mob rule. We can't have full democracy. We can't have one vote for the presidency. We have to have this filter system. This way we can manipulate and control when and as needed, which they certainly have done as needed. The voting and the House and all of these things, their apportionment, all of that was us. That was the House thing. The House can set their own rules. They can make their own, decisions on this until 1929, when they signed that away. They gave the power to the Secretary of Commerce and the Census Bureau, which is underneath the presidency. So it brought the executive branch into it, and it brings the Supreme Court into it, and it limits the House setting their own rules. But they were okay with that because, again, it's consolidation of power they were after, just like the Electoral College allows for that consolidation of power when needed. So abolishing the Electoral College, it has its merits, there's plenty of discussions to be had on that, and it does have its merits. It's not quite that simple, though. It would create other interesting challenges, I believe.
What's truly terrifying, though, is when you hear these discussions about how the idea would be that electors in certain states would not go the way that their voters have. For instance, if people in Wisconsin vote Democratic, electors there would say, well, no, I'm going to vote Republican instead, or vice versa. The idea, I'm not even sure how that works in terms of the system. Can they do that? Because there's been a suggestion that it could be legally done, in which case people could simply buck the result of the elections and choose to basically overthrow the will of the people of their own state and for the country. For that matter.
The challenge here, the challenge with that discussion is every state's different, and that's a huge challenge. Every state sets its own rules for electors. Every state can change rules for electors from election to election. You know, there's block electors where they all go one way. Some states allow you to split the electorals to different people. It does vary, and that is the challenge. Again, this is that tricky part of federal versus state when it comes to elections. You know, this is why we don't have a national election day, which we should have above all other holidays. That should be our secular holiday where we all get the day off to vote, so we don't have to go on our lunch break to stand in a 4-hour line in the rain. Then we give up and don't vote, which is what many people want. Many people want clogged lines, confusion, voter rolls being challenged, people being thrown off the rolls because they had the same name as someone else who voted. All these things are all anti-democratic efforts to keep numbers down and to keep the powers that be in power, as I see it. That's how I see it. Very intentional. A national election day is a no-brainer to me. That should be the easiest thing to do. Everyone, Tuesday, it's the first Tuesday in November. Why can't that be just a national holiday? Let's vote. No, we don't want full voter turnout. Obviously, if we did, it would be a holiday.
I totally agree with you. I love that, Jeff. That's really, I don't know if you could see that, Chuck. Jeff,
that is amazing.
Avatar on there. You win the prize, Jeff. You're it was a little teddy bear before, but it's changed. I think it's a good place to stop today. And I think come back on the 20th of November, and we will continue this talk in a different way. We're going to talk about gerrymandering and the history of that and how that kind of comes into play, because it's all connected, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing you again then, Chuck, and I appreciate you doing this for us. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Outstanding, Chuck. Outstanding.
Thank you. Thanks, Chuck.